1980, 140 miles outside London on the east coast of England. Woodbridge and Bentwaters naval bases under the command of the United States Air Force. Together they formed the largest tactical fighter wing in the world. The two bases were separated by a 3-mile stretch of heavy woods known as Rendlesham Forest. The backdrop for one of the most investigated UFO sightings in history. This is what it looked like just after midnight on December 27th. Woodbridge security supervisor, Sergeant Jim Peniston, rushed to the east gate, where sentries alerted him to strange lights.
My first thought on it was an aircraft downing, a possible aircraft crash. There was a color scheme of red and yellow and some white light. That's the reaction you get with chemicals.
Peniston radioed back to the flight supervisor and was given permission to investigate. He and the sentries advanced into the darkness until they stumbled on a sight they could not explain.
The air, for example, had a feeling of electricity in it. My feelings at the time ran from confusion to disbelief. I could not understand for the life of me what this could be. The craft itself measured approximately 9 feet by 9 feet, triangular in shape. It had no cockpit, as far as I could tell. There was no windows, just this very highly shiny, black, glass-like material. And I think the most fascinating part of it, at least as far as I was concerned as an investigator, was the fact that this had identifiable inscription, symbols on the side of it.
Peniston says he approached the craft. It was warm when he touched it. Suddenly, it began to move, lifting up silently right before his eyes and disappearing into the night sky. Peniston claims he drew this sketch of the craft at a debriefing the next morning with the deputy base commander, Lieutenant Colonel Charles Halt. The next night, Halt received word that the strange lights had returned.
Well, the base commander and I looked at each other quite in disbelief. And I said, well, we both agreed we needed to put this to bed.
Eager to debunk the entire affair, Halt collected a Geiger counter, night vision star scope, and a handheld tape recorder. Then, with a few men from the Disaster Preparedness Unit, he drove to the area where Peniston had seen the UFO. Soon, the portable lights they had brought mysteriously flickered and died. Halt, concerned for the safety of his men, ordered several of them back to the east gate. With the rest of his unit, he walked into the forest checking radiation levels. He says they seemed unusually high. Suddenly, off in the distance, Halt spotted a glowing object. This is the actual recording Halt made of his UFO encounter that night.
Okay, we're looking at the thing. We're probably about 200 to 300 yards away. It looks like an eye winking at you. And the flash is so bright to the star scope that it almost burns your eye. There's no doubt about it. This is weird. There's something very, very strange.
And there we stood. Well, we didn't know quite what to think of that. But when we looked to the north, suddenly there were objects in the sky. And we watched this in awe. Suddenly the object came toward us at high speed. It moved directly toward us. I can't estimate the speed, but it moved very rapidly. Stopped and sent down a pencil-like beam at our feet. And just as fast as the beam appeared, it just clicked off, disappeared. I still have questions as to what happened. I really don't know what it was. I do know it was something strange, something that was controlled by some type of intelligence, and that's about all I really know.
2 weeks later, Halt described the incident in a one-page memo sent to the British Ministry of Defense. The British government never responded to the memo, but word of the encounter spread. 3 years later, UFO researchers pressured the Air Force commander to release the document under the Freedom of Information Act.
Well, he released it. And the very next day I got to meet BBC One, BBC Two, ITV, German TV, Japanese TV, every local radio station. They were waiting on my doorstep at home and at the office. It was just unbelievable.
News of the Rendlesham incident also generated enormous interest from UFO researchers and skeptics. Here was a case with highly credible witnesses, trained Air Force personnel. Tucson astronomer and retired U.S. Air Force pilot James McGahey is a UFO skeptic who investigated Halt and Peniston's alleged encounter. McGahey insists Halt mistook the beams from a lighthouse 5 miles away for a spacecraft.
That object that was winking at him, which is on the tape, is clearly the lighthouse. Now he's looking at the lighthouse, I think, with a starlight scope. Now remember, here comes this beam of light. He's looking at this light with 100,000 times intensity. What it's going to do is it's going to burn out the image in the center, so it's going to become black. And that's what easily explains the beams and these other things.
When Halt's tape is played against the flashing from the lighthouse, this seems to be the case.
Right in this position here, straight ahead, in between the tree. There it is again. Watch, straight ahead off my flash back there. There it is. Hey, I see it too.
I can't explain that. I really don't know. I never gave it any thought. I do know that the whole time we were out there, we could see the lighthouse. And the lighthouse was about 35 or 40 degrees off to our right from where this whole thing took place.
Did area radar operators confirm the UFO sighting? Halt says maybe.
They really didn't confirm they found anything, although later I found out that when they reviewed the tapes, they did find some things on the tape.
If he has a radar report, I'd like to see it, because I investigated this and I couldn't find one.
Skeptics also suggest the Rendlesham UFO might have been a meteor, bright stars, or a Russian satellite that fell out of the sky that night.
To me, this is just a case of where a number of people saw some lights, got a little excited, thought about UFOs, and all of a sudden everything they see is a UFO. The first night, it was a combination of a satellite reentry, a meteor fireball, and a police car driving around in the woods. The second night, it turns out to be a lighthouse, some microwave antennas, and some stars in the sky.
We had a controlled landing. Apparently, there was no crater. We also had a craft that was able to take back off with absolutely no sound, which tells me high technology, and maneuver back through the tree line, rise over the trees, hover momentarily, and then take off at incredible speed. It's just totally ridiculous to even consider that it was a Russian satellite or a meteor. Impossible.
In 1991, believing serious questions were still unanswered, the British government finally responded to the Rendlesham incident. Nick Pope, its top UFO investigator, reopened the case.
I've always felt that Rendlesham Forest is a case which displays a lot of important factors all drawn together. You have a multiple witness event. Those witnesses are trained military observers. The Defence Radiological Protection Service had no explanation as to why the radiation readings taken by Colonel Halt's team were so high. Undoubtedly, something very strange had happened there.
Pope requested further investigation. The British government said no and closed the file. Perhaps in part due to this fact, Sergeant Peniston arrived at the site at approximately 1 a.m. and re-emerged from Rendlesham Forest after dawn, but can only account for less than an hour of his time. Skeptics question how Peniston could make such an historic discovery and yet not report back to the base for several hours.
What we had thought was apparently only maybe an hour's worth of investigation time turned out to be 4 hours. I got a feeling that might have been the adrenaline. We were pumped up at that point in time.
What is it that Peniston says he saw and touched that night? To this day, he is perplexed by the entire incident.
Something that can sustain a controlled flight, something that has mass, something that makes no sound, and something that can take off at incredible speeds back up into the atmosphere. Explain it. I can't.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Charles I. Halt. In 1991, I retired from the U.S. Air Force as a colonel. I was base commander of two large military installations, and at the time of my retirement was Director of Inspections Directorate for the DoD Inspector General. In that capacity, I had inspection oversight of all military services and defense agencies. In 1980, I was the Deputy Base Commander, RAF Bentwaters, the largest twin base complex in East Anglia. At the time, this was the largest tactical fighter wing in the Air Force. In late December 1980, I was called upon to investigate a very strange event, an event that was distracting our security police from their primary duties. Early on the morning of 26 December 1980, our police patrolman discovered strange lights in the forest east of the back gate at RAF Woodbridge. 3 patrolmen were dispatched to investigate. They reported a strange craft, triangular in shape, sitting on 3 legs. The craft was approximately 3 meters on a side. It had multiple lights. It rapidly maneuvered and quickly disappeared. I was not immediately aware of all the details, only being told of strange lights, and I assumed there was a reasonable explanation for this. 2 nights later at the family Christmas party, I was interrupted by the on-duty police commander. He told of strange events and said it was back. Since my boss had to present awards, I was tasked to go out and investigate. I fully expected to find an explanation. I took 2 senior patrolmen with me, a disaster preparedness expert, and the reporting on-duty police officer. At the site, we found 3 1.5-inch indentations, triangular in pattern. Now today I have a plaster cast of one of those 3 indentations. And as you can see, it's about 1.5 inches, maybe 2 inches deep, and about 9 inches across. An interesting point is that the forest floor there was very hard-packed sand. In order to make 3 impressions of this nature, it would have had to have been a very heavy object. We discovered mild radiation and evidence of broken branches on the trees. We suddenly observed a very bright red-orange object. It was oval and with a black center. It reminded me of an eye, and it appeared to be winking or blinking. It maneuvered horizontally through the trees with an occasional vertical movement. When approached, it receded and silently broke into 5 white objects. We moved out of the forest and onto a pasture and observed several objects in the sky, multiple objects to the north. They changed shape from elliptical to round. Several other objects were seen to the south. One approached at a very high speed and sent down a strange beam right at our feet. It was different than an ordinary light, and it didn't radiate. It was more like a laser beam. Another object sent down beams of light into the weapons storage area. The whole time we had difficulty communicating with the base, as all 3 radio frequencies that we were using kept breaking up. This activity continued for about an hour. During this entire event, I was fortunate to have with me my small pocket recorder. It's a little linear recorder that I carried around the base, usually to take notes because I didn't like to write much. So I recorded all the significant events that happened that night. Unfortunately, the tape recorder is no longer functional, but I do have a tape and a good copy of it. I have no idea what we saw that night, but I do know with great certainty it was under intelligent control. I thank you for your attention and will be available for questions after.
And I have said it in public more than once before, there are only 2 explanations for what happened that night in Suffolk. The first is that what the people concerned, including Colonel Holt, who was at the time the deputy commander of the base, and a lot of his soldiers, or airmen, they claim that something from outside the Earth's atmosphere landed at their Air Force base. They went and stood by it, they inspected it, they photographed it. The following day they took tests on the ground where it had been and found radioactive traces. They reported this. Colonel Holt wrote a memorandum which was sent to our Ministry of Defense. He has appeared on British television at least once, to my knowledge, possibly more often, in which he has repeated effectively what he said in that memorandum. And what he said is what I have just described. That is one explanation, that it actually happened as Colonel Holt reported. The other explanation is that it didn't. And in that case, one is bound to assume that Colonel Holt and all his men were hallucinating. My position is perfectly clear. Either of those explanations is of the utmost defense interest. It has been reported and claimed, and I myself have raised it with ministers at the Defense Ministry in this country, who deny that anything they have been informed is of defense interest. Surely, to any sensible person, either of those explanations must be, cannot fail to be, of defense interest. That the colonel of an American Air Force base in Suffolk and his merry men are hallucinating when there are nuclear-armed aircraft on the base must be of defense interest. If indeed what he says took place did take place, and why on earth should he make it up, then surely the entry of a vehicle from outer space, certainly not man-made, to a defense base in this country also cannot fail to be of defense interest. And it simply isn't any good.